welcome. Welcome to the Awkwardly Zen special event, Psychedelics, Spirituality, and Therapy with Heather Lundy. I'm going to go over our rules and guidelines. I know you all have heard them before, but please pay special attention to the guidelines for tonight's event. So first of all, for Awkwardly Zen events, love and light, please. Love and light always. There is no right or wrong here in Awkwardly Zen. You can disagree with someone, but please hold space for them and their point of view. The spiritual path is vast, so please keep in mind that we're all in different places on our path. Be gentle. Keep it safe. Let's tread very lightly with anything too sexual, violent, controversial, or political. We do know that this special event is going to touch on some of those things. So please, please, please be aware and be open to, if you feel the host or one of the moderators redirecting your conversation, just go with the flow, please. The views of our speakers and our Awkwardly Zen members may not be the views of Awkwardly Zen itself. This next part is super important. Please pay attention. You are responsible for your own experience here. Please do your own research before trying anything. I want to emphasize that tonight's event is not about recommending anything. It's about giving you information and educating you. So whatever you hear tonight, do your own research on that. Also, if something mentioned tonight doesn't resonate with you, please leave it behind. Remember that you can always step away from this event if it doesn't resonate. We get it. Please come back and join one of our other events. The other guideline that we usually go over is that we try not to should. I'm going to limit that to when you are able to comment or ask a question. We try not to should. We only try to keep it to our own personal experience and what we have experienced as we share. Medical disclaimer, again, please pay special attention to this. We at Awkwardly Zen are not therapists, doctors, or medical professionals, and we cannot cure, diagnose, or provide any sort of actual medical recommendations. Please see a medical provider or a mental health care professional if you need one. This event will be recorded. We are asking that you do not record this on your own personal devices. However, this event will be recorded and will be available on the Awkwardly Zen YouTube channel at a later date for you to watch. How to participate in this special event. How much you participate is up to you. There will be question and answer sessions. If you feel called to ask a question, please keep yourself muted until it is your turn to talk. Many of you know this, but I want to just re-emphasize that. Please keep yourself muted. Jillian and I will be unmuting you and allowing you to question. You can let us know that you want to question by raising your hand visually or by using the reaction buttons down at the bottom of your screen and raising your hand that way. Or last resort, type it in chat. Jillian and I have our eyes on chat and we'll see your question over there in chat. If Heather is speaking and says something that you really, really resonate with, we have what's called the hand waggle, and that just says, yes, I get it, I support you, or I feel that too. If you are doing anything distracting on camera, please turn your camera off. And if we notice you doing anything distracting, please do not be offended if one of the moderators turns your camera off for you. We are trying to keep this event focused on our wonderful, amazing speaker, Heather. And with that being said, there's only one more thing I want to mention. Heather is going to have question and answer sessions. I mentioned that before. We're just asking that you keep your questions to the topic that is mentioned at hand. If you have some additional information that you want to gather from Heather, or if you're seeking some type of professional consult, please, 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 Heather has many ways that you can get in touch with them, and that will be in the chat. So do that to the side, but let's keep the questions specific to what is being presented in tonight's event. With that being said, let's introduce Heather Lundy. Heather Lundy is a licensed mental health therapist with a master's in clinical mental health and a bachelor's in studio art. They are also the founder and CEO of Quantum Mental Health, and also the founder and CEO of Khesed Wellness. I hope I said that correctly. Um, Heather believes that innovation begins and ends with expanding human consciousness. That's why they start companies, and particularly mental health companies, and center ethics workers and regenerative principles seen in nature, such as mycelium transporting minerals from a tree with surplus to a tree with deficiency hundreds of miles away. Ooh, super interesting. Heather creates companies that invite humans to heal and expand awareness so that we can help heal the world. I love that. And Heather is a very good friend of Awkwardly Zen. So with that being said, I will turn this over to Heather to run the show. Thank you so much for doing this for us, Heather.
Thank you, Valerie. What an introduction. Need to have you for all my introductions. Hello, everyone, wherever you are coming from. I always appreciate a chance to get into our bodies when we gather in a collective space, and how uniquely wonderful when we're in this living room in the sky together. I recognize that we're in different time zones. Some of us may have had to work pretty hard to get here, close some doors and tell some people that we're not available for the next little bit, maybe dependence, shall we say. My dog decided to join us. She's laying next to me. Maybe you're tired. So however you're entering this space, I wanted to just create a moment for us to acknowledge where we are. And for those who are comfortable, I want to do just a brief grounding practice to literally just help us feel our bodies. If you're not comfortable or in a space where you would like to do that, then I invite you to just take a couple moments of silence. If it helps you focus to turn your video off or on, I welcome you doing that. And if you notice that you're not as comfortable as you could be in your chair or where you're laying or sitting, even if you're driving, I invite you to maybe kind of shake out your shoulders a little bit, feel some more space between your ears and your shoulders. Shake out your body. Maybe get some of that tension out of your body if you need to. Feel your feet on the ground beneath you, or even just feel your body held by what's beneath you. And if you're comfortable, I invite you to close your eyes. I'm going to close my eyes and go ahead and take a deep breath, whatever that means for you in this moment. Perhaps you want to take a couple more deep breaths to enter this space, or notice your inhale and your exhale as you enter a rhythm of natural breathing. And if you have thoughts that enter your mind, I invite you to notice them. Notice that they're there, and then just let them go. An image is the thoughts being like a bubble that are kind of drifting up, and then just touching them with a feather. Just noticing they're there and then letting them go and returning to your breath. I invite you to make any additional adjustments to release tension, maybe in your jaw or in your hands, maybe even behind your eyes. If your tongue is glued to the roof of your mouth, you can rest it on the bottom of your mouth. Settling. And now noticing the space around you, maybe the sounds around you, the people, the voices, the traffic, the clock, sensing the space that you're in. And then returning to your breath once again. I invite you to take deeper breaths and count your next 3 breaths. Breathing in through your nose and out your mouth. And then when you're comfortable, you can open your eyes. If you would like, I invite you to maybe say a word of how you feel coming out of that grounding practice. Sometimes it's just wonderful to get into our bodies, isn't it? Well, I am so glad to be here with all of you this evening. It is such a treat to return to Awkwardly Zen. I see new faces, and just as a couple points of reference about who I am and what I do in the world, I am a licensed therapist. As Valerie mentioned, I've been a licensed therapist for about a decade. And I am an entrepreneur who started 6 companies. I'm currently the founder and CEO of 3, and Quantum and Khesed are my main areas of focus. Quantum is new in the world. It launched in April. And so I'm really excited to be able to share Quantum with you. Our mission is to provide affordable psychedelic therapy to the underinsured, which is most of us in the US when it comes to mental health. If you are in another country, I celebrate if access may not be as hard for you. And then Khesed Wellness, the mission is affordable mental health therapy for the underinsured. So you can maybe see a theme between the two. And Khesed is celebrating 6 years this Saturday at our barbecue with our team of 50. And Khesed is in 5 states. We're currently in Texas, Colorado, California, Illinois, and Michigan. And we're in the process of growing nationwide. So if you would like us where you are, you let us know. And then Quantum is currently in Colorado, and we are growing nationally as decriminalization laws and legalization laws start to expand. So for example, you may be aware that Oregon is the first state that's navigating the legal psychedelics space beyond the research capacity. And so we will be looking at entering Oregon next year and then growing from there. So that's a little bit of context for who we are and what we do on that side of things. I also want to acknowledge that as a human, as a person, I'm deeply spiritual. I actually just went to a birth chart reading today, which is a newer practice of mine as far as doing it consistently to grow in my own relationship to my chart. And I would, if I could phrase it as well as I know how to phrase it, I would say I'm a student of consciousness. And I mean that both personally as well as academically. I have a master's degree in theology. I have studied both ancient Koine Greek, classical Greek, and Hebrew. My mother tongue, as I like to say it, because I inherited it through my maternal side, is Christianity. That is the world I was raised in. And now find myself getting to start mental health companies that are in spaces like psychedelics, where there's more and more relationship between the clinical and the spiritual through the portal of medicines like psychedelics. So that's a component about me. I think another thing to know about me is I identify as non-binary. My pronouns are they, them. And I also say that because philosophically, I'm quite non-binary. that will come out through how I speak. And I think one of the gifts of being a non-binary person for me is getting to invite the world to expand beyond our binaries. So you'll hear some of those themes in my approach. And last but surely not least, I am the parent to a mini golden doodle who turns 10 on Christmas Eve, and I adore her. So I am thrilled that she decided to sleep next to me. She fell asleep while we did our grounding, so I guess it was okay. So there's me as a human. Let's talk about what we're going to do tonight. Okay. If any of you appreciate a plan, a clear plan, here it is. I noticed that people tend to come to conversations about psychedelics swelling with questions. And I love that. And so we're going to start with a Q&A. We're going to give you space to kind of get some of those questions out. Then I'm going to talk to you about three things. I'm going to talk to you about architecture as it relates to psychedelic. I'm going to talk to you about therapies, and I'm going to talk to you about relationships. Okay, and I'm going to do some drawing. I'm going to be vulnerable and invite you into my drawing space and share my screen. And then we're going to end with Q&A. So what I invite you to do is, as you hear me talking in that middle section, consider questions that bubble up. Or maybe at the beginning Q&A, you have questions that bubble up. There will be one more opportunity. I'm an introvert, so I always appreciate multiple opportunities for Q&A as well. And then we'll close it up. As a point to start, there are a couple disclaimers. Valerie, I appreciate the disclaimers you covered, but there are a couple disclaimers I wanna frame how we're gonna contain the space in general, but especially the Q&A space. Number one, I am not recommending psychedelics here. There is research, and there is growing research for people in populations where psychedelics are not beneficial and can be quite harmful. And so I just invite all of us to honor exactly what Valerie said, do your own research and honor your own body, your own biochemistry, your own path, and also the guidance of the experts in your world that you can trust to engage your path. Second, I am only going to discuss the legal psychedelic space. I am not going to discuss the non-legal. Now, the legal space can include conversation about decriminalization, for example, which is kind of an in-between area that we can get into if anybody would like to. But I am not going to discuss accessing psychedelics in non-legal ways or anything in that realm. Also, this is not therapy. I am a licensed therapist, but this space is not therapy. So I will draw a boundary if questions start to lean that direction. And then last, but surely not least, we are all students of psychedelics, including me. Well, you may not want to be, so feel free to opt out. But I say that to say, while I am a provider, while I do have training, it can be easy in an early adoption stage of a new industry to lean on people like me as the ultimate expert. But we are really in a new realm in the mental health field of understanding how to do this space well, especially as we integrate psychedelics with Western mental health. So I may do some caveating or just acknowledging my limitation in my answers. Okay, fair enough? I appreciate all the support I can get. So feel free to engage as you would like. All right, without further ado, I'm going to open it up for Q&A for you to raise your hand. I trust Jillian and Valerie to moderate chat as questions come through there. So what questions do you have about psychedelics therapy, and spirituality. Go. Susan.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm a nurse that works in psych, and I'm currently working on my master's to become a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner. And I'm interested in ways that I can grow my learning in some of the non-traditional, or what we're not typically taught in school. So I guess I'm curious about venues for building that knowledge while I'm going through school. So if you have any suggestions for those kind of avenues.
Absolutely. I would say a great national container to be aware of is MAPS, maps.org, maps.org. And that is the central research advocacy company that is connected to the FDA and all the trials that are being done with MDMA. They are creating a certification process with the FDA of what provider requirements will look like upon FDA approval. And so you can really, and they've also done a great job to publicly source information, both academic information as well as like resources and access points. And so I think you just perusing that to let it take you where it leads you is a great place to start. Another two resources to be aware of. One is the Integrative Psychiatry Institute, which is an organization that is actually seeking to be a central training body. And they do virtual 6-month programs that are essentially the training that you're talking about you wanting before we have all the answers for legalization, but they are forming relationships with MAPS to be able to allow continuing education to just be built upon rather than having to start over once legalization unfolds. So integrativepsychiatryinstitute.org is another great resource to be aware of. And then last, the largest nonprofit in the psychedelic space is called the SAGE Institute. I've had the joy of being on a personal phone call with their CEO and board. And they're also working hard to do training for professionals. And the URL is actually the integrativepsychiatryinstitute.org, just FYI. So those are 3 resources to help. All right, next question. I'm not sure who came up first, Valerie.
I'm not either, so we'll go with Misha.
Okay.
All right, Misha.
Hi. Thank you for doing this. Can you tell me what psychedelics are legal, like in Colorado, or do you know?
Psychedelics are not currently legal statewide in Colorado. Denver, Colorado was the first city to decriminalize psilocybin, which means you can personally use and personally cultivate psilocybin, but you cannot manufacture, sell, or distribute it. Oregon is the only state that passed legalization so far in the US, but they also legalize all substances. They kind of went a non-medical model for their legalization. And so there's typically a 2-year turnaround from legalization to when the states can actually issue business licenses and businesses can start. And so it's projected that in 2023, Oregon will be ready to let that unfold. There is a lot of legislation in a lot of states around further decriminalization of certain psychedelics. And Colorado actually has something on the ballot in November for legalizing psilocybin statewide. There's also been a really significant unfolding in over 100 cities nationwide over the last 3 or so years for decriminalizing psilocybin in certain cities. And if you just Wikipedia decriminalization of psychedelics, you can find out more about those cities in particular. Now, I will have a caveat in saying that ketamine is one substance that has been legalized. And it's been legalized under a medical model, which means you go to a ketamine clinic and you get an infusion, but it doesn't necessarily come with therapy. So psychedelic assisted therapy is when there's therapists present, usually two, when you're taking the substance. And ketamine is also referred to as psychedelic-like because it does have psychedelic components, but it is a dissociative anesthetic. And so it has, every psychedelic has slightly different dynamics to it. But ketamine has definitely been widely used in supporting substance use treatment as well as things like depression. So there's some parallels there. So ketamine is a legalized psychedelic and it's currently present, but MDMA has been the psychedelic that's been the main focus of federal research and FDA research. And then psilocybin, which is mushrooms, for those of you who are learning the psychedelic space, that's another term that's been used for them, but derived from fungi. And there's also biopharmaceutical companies developing human-made versions of psilocybin. That is getting more of that decriminalization focus.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
You bet. Charity. Oh, I think you went back on mute.
Sorry, am I there? Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could kind of explain what a psychedelic experience refers to. I mean, I know what psychedelics are, but like when I think of MDMA versus mushrooms, those are two completely obviously different experiences, maybe for most people, but it's hard for me to imagine like MDMA is like a psychedelic versus when you think of mushrooms, I think of a psychedelic. So I guess I was saying like, how do they define what considered a psychedelic experience is? And also I was going to ask if you could kind of explain what quantum mental health does provide. I mean, I know you a little bit touched on it, but I was looking at the site and I just trying to get an understanding of what it does offer. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me make sure I can tend to both questions. So a psychedelic experience has a spectrum to it, right? Because if you were to kind of say on one end of the spectrum is microdosing, where that's below your sense of perception, right? You don't have cognitive shifts. That is a form of engaging with psychedelics. And there's research about how microdosing can still do things like increase neuroplasticity, which is what psychedelics are known to do broadly, which basically allows your brain to rewire certain patterns of your thinking. So a great visual that I recently heard from a neuroscientist is imagine your brain like taking a sled down a snow hill. And as you go down the same track, the grooves get deeper, right, in the snow. And that's kind of how your brain forms patterns. And so what neuroplasticity does is it allows your brain to feel that plasticity, to feel that ability to not be so treaded into the same tracks. Because some of those deeply treaded tracks may be things like trauma that you're trying to get out of and reframe in your own life, or depression patterns, or whatever it may be. And so some of the classic ways people may frame a psychedelic experience being something like tripping, that can be an experience. But a lot of what research is exploring is kind of, there's an expansive spectrum. And just like you said, different psychedelics are produce different dynamics and different experiences. Another psychedelic, ayahuasca, is really almost exclusively experienced in a ceremonial setting. The length of time a person experiences a psychedelic ranges depending on what you engage with. So every person's experience is distinct, but some of those themes are literally the brain chemistry of neuroplasticity, and also the ability to shift frames of awareness and patterns of thinking. Now, intention is a really important component to consider with psychedelics, because what the research is showing is that your intention impacts what happens. So like, for example, in what some people think of in psychedelics through history is how it was used within the 60s to expand consciousness and have altered experiences at Woodstock, and modern day examples, Burning Man, perhaps, or what have you. And those can be meaningful, altering experiences, but if a person doesn't go in with the intention of addressing their depression, they may not become less depressed afterwards. So that's where a lot of research is showing how important integration work is, which is the therapy after the experience to invite that growth and adjustments and shifting. And what we're also seeing is that when you engage therapeutic dosing, so that is when you have cognitive shifts and you can have visual experiences and perceptions. Some people talk about like trees breathing when they're sometimes on a psilocybin trip, and this ultimate oneness with all things. So there's different archetypal or thematic components that come up. But the intention and the integration research is showing is really where the lasting impact comes into play. So there's value if you want to incorporate it through other dynamics, depending on who you are and what you're seeking. But when you talk about therapy, that's an important distinction. As far as quantum mental health, so we are a model that's making right now, with where legalization is, the preparation, so before someone's going to engage in experience, and the integration after they've engaged in experience, as affordable as possible. So just to give you some math, very brief math, very simple math, we won't get too crazy, don't worry. The standard average cost of an integration or preparation session in the mental health psychedelic space in the US right now is averaging $300 an hour. I don't know about you, but I don't know many people that can afford $300 an hour with any kind of frequency, much more maybe the first time. At Quantum, we charge $75. One of the things that you'll hear when you start to engage the US psychedelic industry is that as we're seeking legalization, what's unique about psychedelics, because I also want to frame that in, I'm going on a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think it's valuable. So work with me, we'll circle back. But the US psychedelic industry can sometimes get connected to the US cannabis industry, because they were both part of dynamics related to the war on drugs, which thankfully on a number of levels, particularly racially, we are moving beyond. The truth is, though, that the legalization process for cannabis compared to psychedelics is quite different. Because when you have something led by the FDA, which is what the psychedelic research studies are in relationship with, that really impacts international legalization and dynamics with countries who are engaged with this industry. A country can choose to opt out, but psychedelics is really an international conversation. There's been longstanding research in Europe, even when the US was lost in the war on drugs. Europe was continuing its research. There's a lot of research that's come out of Israel. It's really been a worldwide investment. And so I lost myself in my own train of thought, but there's some important ways of understanding how all of that is playing out. did I miss part of the question? What quantum is doing? Is that where we're circling back to? Can I get a nod? Yep. So what quantum is doing is entering areas at the decriminalized stage. So where there's more wide acceptance and use of psychedelics, such as mushrooms that you have cultivated and are using personally to provide that pre and post therapy, that outpatient therapy. And then as states legalize, we can adjust our model to work with whatever that state is doing. Because for example, some states are going through what's called a more medical-based model, where you need a medical director on site potentially, or you need these different components, whereas like states like Oregon are creating facilitation models where a person can go to a company to have someone as what's called a facilitator or a sitter that is trained to do so, but may not be an MD. And have businesses that are created to be those containers. And what that also does is support the uninsured and the marginalized. I remember what I was trying to say earlier. So the point I was trying to make is that because the FDA is involved, one of the things that quantum does is address that really pharmaceuticals and insurance are the center of this conversation in order to get legalization. But what that means also in the US system is that skyrockets pricing. So as you get to know psychedelics, you'll learn that the number one issue is cost for the client out of pocket, what that's actually going to mean and look like. And so the goal of quantum mental health is to make that a non-issue from the beginning and make access as easy as possible while still taking care of the provider. I brought the thought back together. It is getting late today. All right, next question. Let's go.
I'm going to go to the chat because there's some questions that have been sitting there. That was beautiful, and I love what your company is doing. Question from the chat: in the states that it's legal, how do I know I'm getting legit stuff? Is there anything I should look for?
In the states where it is legal or it is not legal?
Where it is legal.
So in the states where it is legal, I recommend working with a doctor that you trust. There's more and more psychiatrists, nurse practitioners, medical doctors that are entering this space. I encourage people to follow their intuition just because they say this is their specialty. If you meet with them and you do not resonate and everything in you is saying, don't trust this person, interview other people. Trust is the number one factor in therapeutic relationships. And so I don't just say that without research behind what I'm saying. And if you're engaging with things like psilocybin, in the legal space, there will be governing requirements for quality standards when places like Oregon start selling it direct to consumer. And if you are engaging it in a legal manner through maybe a friend who cultivated it, then I would encourage you to do your own research to have confidence that what you're getting is quality. And there's not more to that I can say.
Perfect, thank you. One more question from the chat and then we'll go to the hands raised if you have time for that. Is LSD therapy available in Colorado is the question in chat.
LSD is still within the research arena, so I would encourage you to first check out MAPS as a place to learn about the different psychedelic institute research bodies. I'm not currently aware of a LSD research study in Colorado. Most of the focus right now is on MDMA, but LSD is definitely part of the conversation. So. And unfortunately, I do not have a direct reference, but those are some places where you can look for more information.
Perfect, thank you. And do we have time for more questions or?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
We do 90 minutes total typically, yes?
Yes.
Okay, we're still good on my end.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and go to Kara, who has her hand up.
Hey, Valerie, it is Kara. Hi, Heather. Okay, so if somebody is microdosing, so not on a therapeutic level, and finding things that their intuition says is fine. So good there. Are there things that, and let's just be real. I'm working with a therapist, but not on this. So I'm feeling very supported in a lot of ways. And are there any things that someone like that might need to be looking for in their microdosing? Like if they're not actually having experiences that are altered, but they're doing a 6-week on, say 4-week off regimen and noticing changes, but is there anything that, like you were talking about earlier about the snow and going through the same ruts and stuff, are there things that if there are some ruts, I go, oh, I'm very aware of this rut. Let's really think about that, or let's try and change that. And when I see that, or the triggers or whatever, change. But are there any other tactics that you would suggest for someone who is in a protocol of microdosing to just be aware of?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna go back to one thing I said earlier and just kind of emphasize it in this very context of intention, but also like clear intention. Because, you know, we can be aware of like, yeah, we're maybe predisposed toward anxiety, right? But what specific patterns is someone noticing in their anxiety that they're wanting to address? And writing those intentions or speaking those intentions into therapy creates a container that's clear for that specific time. And then the second practice that I always encourage people to navigate with your therapist or within your own practice to follow that line is journaling. And for that to be like a intended practice within the microdosing. So when people tend to microdose and then just kind of go about their day, right, and maybe just feel more relaxed, but like they just took it before they, you know, left for a walk, but there was really no set intention, then that can kind of feed into what I mentioned earlier of people can engage with psychedelics, but it's not necessarily transformative apart from the moment, or even in the broader scheme, if it's not purposefully integrated into some of that clarifying self-work, whether it's directly with your therapist or not.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I think a good example, if anybody is a science or research mind, is there's been research studies on the cessation of smoking and how psychedelics is one of the most powerful treatments, and research being found for the permanent cessation of smoking. But what some of the research has shown is those who went into the study that identified as smoking, but not wanting to stop, went through the psychedelic treatment and continued smoking after. Whereas others who went into their treatment with the desire to stop smoking had better outcomes in their ability to continue to not smoke. So yeah, that's one example.
Hi. I guess, so obviously every person is totally different, but, and I say typically, and I know that there isn't a typical, but for a regimen, because it is obviously apparent that some people have never thought of this in their therapy, and then there are people that are using it currently in their therapy. So there's kind of this broad range, but I don't even know, like, how long would you typically, like, I don't even know. Can you describe a typical, like, if I was to walk into your office and be like, hey, this is what I think I want to try this, you know, do we do, you know, like 5-10 sessions before we do it? And then what is the regimen? Would you use daily? Would you use weekly, like monthly? You know, and then is that for 5 years? Is that for 2 weeks? So sorry.
No, I that is such a fair question. I really appreciate it. And I think that that's where I'm going to point back to being students of psychedelics. Right now, we're in a time that's starting to get referenced as a psychedelic renaissance, which I think has some real beauty and potential and opportunity, and it has some real shadows and considerations and checkpoints. And one of those checkpoints is we are in the midst of the research for understanding regimens and dosing spectrums. And the research has been going on for a long time. We're not entering this fresh, right? Like there's been decades and decades and decades. It's really important to clarify that even in the US, when there was a prohibition on psychedelics, there was still research occurring. Johns Hopkins being one of the leading bodies and the oldest psychedelic institute in the nation. And so with that in mind, you know, I kind of lost my train of thought. Remind me again of the original question. I started getting into my riff. Valerie.
That was Jen. Where's Jen at?
Jen. Oh yeah, regimens and stuff. Okay, so my answer to your question is number one, listening to your intuition. So there's some people who immediately have resistance to the idea of a therapeutic dose where they have an altered state of consciousness, where they have images coming up and kind of start to go into the depths of their subconscious. And so microdosing may feel just more intuitively accessible to engage their treatment, while others, the therapeutic dosing can be really important to engaging their treatment. That being said, if I were to give you a range of regimens, it tends to be 12 to 15 sessions for a lot of the psychedelic studies, where there's several sessions of the preparation, around 3 sessions with the substance, and then the rest of the sessions for the integration work. But that being said, you also have to consider different traditions, which is something I'm going to get into a little bit more of. You know, an ayahuasca ceremony can be a retreat, can be an intensive experience. Those who are microdosing, that can be a multi-year experience. And so every person and every person's needs it's important to be tended to, and it's important to acknowledge that we're in the midst of research that is teaching us more and more about regimens and lengths and frequency and all those things.
Perfect, thank you. Leslie, I see your hand up. We're going to jump over to chat for a minute because a couple have been hanging out. Heather, feel free to cut me off if we get into the questions too much. This question is, now I've got to scroll back to it, forgive me. I'm a licensed therapist in California. What is the first step in getting involved when psychedelics are not legalized yet in my area, Los Angeles? Question, also, is it worth it to get trained in it before it's legal?
Great question. First of all, shout out to LA. It's where I was born and raised. California Psychedelic Institute, definitely check out what they're doing. California has some interesting legislative ballot stuff coming up. You know, one of the things we are seeing is that there is a similar wave of states that were the first to legalize in cannabis, or some of the states that are becoming the first to kind of pass legislation. So Colorado, California, Oregon. So I would say, as yes, we are in the early adoption stage, California will be one of the early state adopters. So I think preparing for that is thoughtful. Education from a organization that's in some kind of partnership with MAPS, to me, would be the most strategic preparation, because those are the places where you won't have to redo programs once the FDA clarifies what the certification requirements will be. So Integrative Psychiatry Institute, even though they're based in Boulder, they have a partnership with MAPS that will translate. I'm actually in one of those cohorts and had a conversation with someone from South Africa this morning. So, and lots of people from California are jumping into that. So it is worthwhile, but make sure you check the legitimacy of the training in their partnerships with those who will manage certifications after it's legalized.
Thank you. And the second question from chat, and then we'll go to Leslie. Do you have to live in Colorado to schedule a session with Quantum?
Great question. And then we'll also have Leslie's be the last question for now. I'm going to talk and we'll have questions at the end. So mental health as an industry is governed by the state. That's true across the US. Every state governs the mental health in their state. So that's why there's the weirdness when you're in the clinical mental health world, that you have to stay within your state's jurisdiction, if you will, to use a legal term. And so what that means is that the person needs to be in the state when they're receiving the therapy, and or a resident of the state. So quantum mental health is virtual completely right now. And if you wanted to road trip to Colorado, if you don't live here, to receive your sessions while you're in Colorado, that would be a way for you to work with us, honoring that we're within Colorado and we're under Colorado mental health laws. But there is a requirement that we stay within the state lines.
Perfect, thank you. Go ahead, Leslie.
Oh, muted Leslie. One more try. Gotta love Zoom.
All right.
There we go.
I don't do this very often, as you can tell. So I've got two questions. I don't know what MDMA is. And then my other question is, I kind of was interested in this, the microdosing for chronic pain, but it sounds like this is more mental health therapy, correct?
Not necessarily. There is actually studies right now on chronic pain. I know that there's research right now on fibromyalgia. There's also research being done on eating disorders. And so we are really only scratching the tip of the iceberg of what treatment for different experiences can be, including physical pain.
Okay. And then what is MDMA?
Okay, so I think that I would welcome you just researching a bit more online, because there's a lot to learn in depth, but I think a good way to frame it is it's a synthetic psychedelic. Okay. So it's a human-made psychedelic, and depending on your dosing can be a multi-hour experience of that altered state of consciousness and engaging with your subconsciousness. The feelings or the intensity, this was kind of referenced in a question earlier, of MDMA can have some distinctions that are different than psilocybin / mushrooms or LSD or ketamine. And so because MDMA is human made, which means it can be really controlled in the bioscience realm. And because of the nature of its length being a little bit more contained than other types of psychedelics, it's really gaining kind of some of the central focus in legalization. So that's why you're hearing about it more and more.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. You bet. All right, so I will go ahead and jump into what I wanted to briefly share. And, you know, in the day and age of technology and presentations and high-end stuff, I thought I would bring us back to our roots of drawing stick figures and circles to help kind of capture some of what I'm trying to share with you. So I am going to share my screen briefly with you. Welcome to my drawing board. And as an introduction to this conversation, you may remember the title of our topic today, Psychedelics, Spirituality, and Therapy. I want to talk about three, all right, let's try it. There we go, architectures. I didn't say it would be super legible, but I said it would be a drawing. We're going to talk about three architectures of psychedelics. We're going to talk about three therapies of psychedelics. And then we're going to round out the relationships between psychedelics, spirituality, and therapy. And I'm going to do this in about 10 minutes. Okay. So let's talk about architectures first. So there's really 3 architectures that are most common in psychedelics. Another way to say this would be 3 different containers, 3 different spaces. Another frame, because just like the reference to MDMA and Leslie's wonderful question, some of the language of psychedelics is also evolving, and we're all learning it together. But a common phrase you hear about in psychedelics is set and setting. But the setting where you have the experience is really important. Some talk about the importance of nature in the experience, right? So when I say architectures, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the 3 most common containers used for psychedelics. So the first one to be aware of is ceremony. And so the image I'm going to give for ceremony, where'd it go? Let's try this, my drawing. Oh no, the drawing isn't working like it was. All right. Well, if I can't get it back online, I'm going to show you pictures that I drew earlier, because that's how we improv in the Zoom world, isn't it? Okay, so give me a second while I improv with my lack of ability to draw. And yes, I do have an undergrad in art, but my undergrad is in ceramics and sculpture, because I never understood how to draw. So for those of you who think you're not creative because you can't draw, you can get an art degree and not draw. So I don't buy it for 1 second. Okay, so the 3 architectures. So there's ceremony. Can we all see that okay? Somewhat. There's therapy, and then there's recreation. And if you were to draw an image, again, we can all draw this image of ceremony. I would draw all these little circles that are in a round together. And the reason for that is we need to acknowledge from the beginning of this conversation that psychedelics have been part of human history for thousands upon thousands of years. It has been an indigenous, cultural, religious, communal practice for thousands upon thousands of years. And so we in the Western mental health world are entering a long lineage of wisdom that belongs to specific cultures and people. And that acknowledgement is important because there's wisdom to glean from, and there's also wisdom to honor. So there's for example, movements right now in the psychedelic space to protect wild peyote from cultivation, because it's right now being overly cultivated by non-indigenous people. And if you're not aware, wild peyote takes about 15 years to cultivate. It's a cactus. And so there is movement to protect the use and cultivation of wild peyote exclusively by indigenous people. Ayahuasca retreats have been a long-standing practice within those spaces. And so ceremony has been and continues to be a central way that humans have engaged their own evolution. It's almost exclusively in a communal setting held by elders or shamans or spiritual leaders. It is specifically used for catalyzing experiences after someone has gone through a life-changing experience or a desire to evolve. And there's ways that as legalization in the US grows and worldwide, there's important considerations to both learn as well as support and honor and advocate for that architecture of psychedelics. The second architecture is the one that we're learning more about. Here we go. And that is the therapy. So I drew 3 circles, kind of looking like a triangle. And the reason I did that is because the central container in the legalizing of psychedelics in the clinical mental health world in the US and internationally in the clinical setting is really with a co-facilitation model. So there's at least 2 therapists in the room when the person is engaging with the substance. There's multiple reasons for that, but I think that's just important to be aware of, that that's kind of the container that's getting formed for how individual therapy can work with psychedelics. Now, the last example I want to give is recreational. So that's what that word says. And there's one little circle in there. And that's really to represent the self, that people engage with psychedelics in different settings and contexts. And like we've already mentioned multiple times, it can have different levels of impact, from truly being recreational, but I also don't use that word in a negative connotation. A person can just engage with psychedelics on their own terms. Now, again, I really encourage you to do your research and get professional support. It's really important that you understand things like dosing and things like what you're getting. And so again, I encourage you to do some research for your specific area, but that's kind of the last most common container. So for example, in the US, the most common psychedelic people engage with presently is psilocybin or mushrooms. And so knowing that that really comes historically through more recreational settings or more personal use settings is just important to consider. Obviously, there's more risks within that setting because it's less of a container that's held. In the ceremonial setting, elders hold that container. In the therapeutic setting, professionals hold that container. So there may not necessarily be a set and setting that's appropriate in the recreational setting, or it may be a very transformational personal experience. So understanding the degrees of risk as well as the traditions and where those three architectures are at is an important component to understanding psychedelics. Okay. The second component, I want to briefly talk about therapies. And we already kind of referenced this, so I'm going to show you the picture at the same time. So the picture is this. There's an arrow pointing toward a circle, pointing toward another arrow. How do you like that for drawing? And really that's trying to capture the first type of therapy is preparation. So that's before someone is going to do an experience. That person could have no knowledge and they're just starting their journey. They could have been planning this for a while and they already have their ketamine treatments scheduled. Whatever that is, those are the sessions before. Now, if someone's engaging repetitive treatments, right, this is kind of before the start of it. And then anything after the experience or between experiences is the integration, right? So if we were to say it as simply as possible, the preparation is where you set the intentions, you understand the container, the process, and then integration is after you've had the experience. Now, in the mental health world, when a therapist is in the room with a person when they engage with the substance, which is not legal right now, right? Like that is what is being done in research. It is not legal for a therapist to just openly be in the room when a person's doing psychedelics, apart from ketamine, right? Ketamine is the one treatment that is legalized and can be in a ketamine center with a therapist. But everything else right now, the psychedelic assisted part is only happening in research settings, but that is when the therapist is in the room. So remember that those three circles like a triangle, that's when two therapists are in the space while a person is navigating their therapeutic dose. So those are the three types of therapy of psychedelics: preparation, psychedelic assisted, integration, before, during, and after. Okay. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the relationships between therapy, psychedelics, and spirituality. So I was really excited about this drawing, but since it's already where we are, if I were to capture what therapy is when you're doing therapy as it relates to psychedelics, view it like a container. It's the container for the person to engage their inner work. Psychedelics are intentionally self-directed, meaning the client is directing their own work. That's an important part of it. And they're really the container and facilitator of the space. The psychedelics is like this arrow. that you can see it kind of goes into the container and it comes out the other side. Another way you can look at this is the psychedelic experience invites the person to engage their subconscious and then invite what they learn to come out of that experience with them. And so psychedelics are really catalysts, right? Opportunities, invitations for us to engage with that space. And then spirituality in the midst of this conversation, best I could, it's kind of these little hashed marks as a circle with arrows coming outward. How do you like that for a visual? And the idea is that spirituality is really the invitation to expand our awareness, as simply as I know how to say it. Whatever that means for you, whatever your relationship to higher power, soul, spirit looks like. But the idea is that the relationship between those three worlds is that that is the bigger picture conversation, right? And that therapy is one container of three containers we talked about. Therapeutic doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be in a clinical setting, right? Ceremonies can be quite therapeutic for people. Now, there's also shadows to consider. There's been some real harm caused by facilitators that have not appropriately held spaces of ceremony. That's been known. There was research came out a couple years ago about therapists mishandling spaces of MDMA treatment. So again, trusting your provider, doing this in an informed way is a really important component. But if you were to talk about the relationships, there are distinctions between spirituality, therapy, and psychedelics, but there's also integrations of those worlds. A word I recently heard that I love, it's my new favorite word. I always love saying great word, you know, when you find a great word. But the word is consilience, CONSILIENCE, consilience. And it's this idea of a unity of knowledge. And in a lot of ways, that can be the invitation of how psychedelics relates to spirituality and your therapeutic work of your mental health. Is that there's this unity that can feel like all are kind of one, while also being aware that there's distinctions. I did that with 3 minutes to spare. So we covered 9 things, just to be clear. We covered 3 architectures, and they're the most common architectures of psychedelics: ceremony, therapy, recreation. 3 types of therapy: preparation, assisted, integration, and then the 3 relationships. So with that being said, let's jump into some more questions. What bubbled up for you as we talked?
Love that. That was perfect timing there, Heather. Let me just mention there are a multitude of questions in the chat. If we don't get to your question, I would like to direct everyone to Heather's website, because I just checked it out and there is an excellent frequently asked questions page on that website, which might answer some of your questions if we're unable to get to them during this event. With that being said, I don't see any hands in the air, so I will go to one of the most prevalent questions that's been hanging out for a while. Let me find it, just a moment. That's the theme song, y'all. 1 moment.
Yeah. Put in my vinyl player.
Here we go. All right. I've heard that psychedelics can be helpful in repairing the effects of SSDI medications to combat and help reduce lingering side effects from those medications. Have you heard of that?
You know, there's been different types of research and different components in those ways. And I would say I'm not, a specific study doesn't come to mind, but I'm also a very research guided person. So me being able to acknowledge if something specific comes to mind is important, but I have read articles about what you're talking about. And I would encourage you to talk to a provider that is familiar with the relationship between SSRIs and psychedelics to talk about that transition. But one of the things that research is showing, for example, is with SSRIs, really gaining prominence in psychiatry in the 80s, there's need for daily use, right? And you can sometimes be having that daily use for years. And one of the components of psychedelics is that after therapeutic treatment, that person can have continued positive side effects for months and even years afterwards. And so there's not potentially the same need for daily use. So if that's what you're referring to, there is a lot of growing research about that shift. I will acknowledge, and this is a little bit of the side of my personality that wants to kind of checkpoint how psychedelics are getting treated as like the next gold rush. Because there's a lot of biases that are coming in of like psychedelics are like a magical pill. And number one, I think it's important to really check the transactionalism of that. This is a medicine that's known to have distinct impacts based on the relationship the person has with the medicine. So even the idea of like ingesting the substance in the same way that we would an SSRI is really qualitatively quite different. For some people that may be quite exciting and relieving, but I think it's an important thing to know. And also there's already research trying to checkpoint that the truth is the psychiatry world is looking for better solutions, because there was a promise in the 1980s that we would solve depression with SSRIs and solve anxiety. And what we know is that our rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide are worse than ever. And there's a lot of national conversation that we're in a second pandemic, and it's a mental health pandemic. And so there's a desire for psychedelics to be the answer for all things. So could it be transformational? Absolutely. And I think it's important to be aware of those other contexts.
Perfect, thank you. Charity, let's go with Charity.
Do you know if there's been any research in regards to genetic testing with psychedelics? Do you know how they do for certain medicines? They test to see how your body's going to react to it. That, you know, you may be better off with some other antidepressant versus another one based on your genetic profile. Have they done anything with that? Do you know of with psychedelics?
There's not as much public information about those kinds of details yet. I think that the research worlds are kind of, you know, keeping that focus internal on that end, but there are common like health conditions to be aware of. So for example, MDMA can raise your blood pressure. So if you already navigate high blood pressure, that's really important to be aware of. It may be a deterrent, but there is monitoring of vitals when you engage with any of those substances in a medical therapeutic setting. So less information I can give you about genetics, and I think just points of awareness about certain health conditions that are pre-existing cautions to engaging with psychedelics. There is some studies, this is a little bit of a left field, but since you said the word genetics, around epigenetics. So the ways that our genetics have been impacted by generational traumas. For example, there's been a lot of research within the Jewish community related to genetic impacts generationally from World War II, and also people of color for the impacts of hundreds and thousands of years of slavery. And there's not a specific link I can point you to, but I do know that there's research being done as it relates to specifically ancestral work and epigenetic work, and being led by people of color, which is also really exciting to see leaders that represent fields of study leading the studies. I actually got to hear a lecture last week by the first person of color to provide psychedelic assisted therapy. So.
Awesome, I love that. Question, Heather. Your brilliant illustration where it showed the container and the person going in, and you mentioned subconscious, my mind went to tying that to spirituality. And would that assist in working on things like when we say, well, that must be buried in your subconscious, and I say, well, how do I get there? Would it assist in that? And I'm thinking specifically shadow work, and terms I use is cutting cords to things that I might not be consciously aware of, but that are holding me back or restricting me in some way. And with that question, I'm thinking that it will lend itself to that beautifully, but are there specific pockets of spirituality where you see that psychedelics benefit more greatly in those areas as opposed, or is it just like everywhere? I know I threw a bunch of questions at you. Feel free to answer just one. Thank you.
Let me see if I can do, let me see if I can do it. That feels like a great challenge. I think I'll begin this answer by saying there's definitely research about the existential impacts and opportunities and potentials of psychedelic therapy, particularly for those who are already drawn to spirituality. So again, back to my point about intention, if a person doesn't come into the psychedelic experience seeking a spiritual shadow work, cleansing of the mirror, cutting of the cords, their experience may not lend that direction. Now, depending on dosage, depending on psychedelic, there can be some more universals about people maybe experiencing their ego dissolving, facing death anxiety, like there can be those kinds of themes. But as far as what you're talking about existential exploration, facing spiritual patterns, psychedelics are known to kind of eliminate the roadblocks, if you will, or those tread lines that can restrict us from engaging the work you're talking about. One of the common analogies that's kind of coming to the surface that even guided my really complex container image, because this complexity is in the simplicity, right? But even this image of the container is one that's used if you treat it like the top is the surface of water and this is the bottom of the ocean. And therapists will often say, view yourself as going into the depths of your subconscious with the lifting of some of those barriers that have prevented you from accessing those spaces before. There's a lot of emphasis on PTSD and the impact that psychedelics can have, particularly on acute, complex PTSD. So to answer your question, yes, with the caveat that it's particularly impactful for those drawn and desiring that. Can be impactful. Perfect.
Thank you. I believe I'm phrasing this next question correctly. It's kind of broken up. But the question is there an age limit? And I believe that's referring to the age limits that you work with personally in your practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we work with adults. Now there's some spaces that are doing, for example, if you're not familiar with something like ketamine has been commonly used for a long time, even with children, as a treatment internationally, if a child, for example, had like a deep lesion and needs pain relief. So there may be instances, for example, where adolescents may be engaging the legal use of different psychedelics for medically guided treatments, but by and large, it's adults. We do some harm reduction, but we really resource out for people who are wanting to engage that space. And our focus is really on those who are 21 or older. Yeah. And we're also, I want to acknowledge, outpatient only. So we don't do crisis treatment. We don't do, if someone's having a really bad experience, there's a great resource called the Fireside Project that has specifically been created as a phone hotline to call if you need an immediate support, and it's peer support led. There's also an organization, I can't remember the name, that goes to festivals to provide harm reduction support. Quantum does not do that. We do outpatient mental health therapy.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to do one more question from chat, and then we'll do Charity, and then we'll let you wrap it up if that's okay. All right.
Sounds great.
What happens when someone has a bad trip while in a therapy session?
So this is actually, I really appreciate that question because it's good reality checking. It's also where my non-binariness comes out a little bit, because that frame of bad, I would want to understand, what does that mean? Now, I know we don't really have as much time in this context to go perhaps in the complexities of that. But what I can say is within therapeutic settings, those preparation sessions are really built around creating the container for the psychedelic assisted session. So that's including agreements with the therapist around, for example, things like some people are comfortable with their hand being held. Some people do not want to be touched at all. You know, there's many different layers of how to create that container to be as safe as possible and supportive of a positive experience. Now, psychedelics are known to both invite sensations of euphoria at times and really intense experiences of shadow work at other times, sometimes both in the same session, depending on what you're navigating. And so if by bad you mean hard, I would say what we notice is that those who have the most resistance can also see that come through the process. But in a therapeutic setting, when you open yourself to what's coming up and don't resist it, that can help with some of the resistance. But we in the therapy world don't view hard as bad. So I think it's important to clarify that component. And then it's really important to do the experience in a set and setting that is relaxing and comforting and trusting. So again, trusting your intuition with who you're working with is key.
Beautiful. Thank you. Charity.
Last question.
This may be too political or too big of a last question, but I'm just kind of curious. I've noticed that a lot of the research they are doing are on the human synthetic drugs, more of like the MDMA. And is there, I guess, kind of like a checks and balance with pharmaceutical companies and not wanting them to, their motivation to be a money making theme behind psychedelics versus doing a lot more research maybe on something that's more natural like mushrooms? Does that make sense? I'm just trying to know the intention, I guess, behind the research and making sure that someone's kind of keeping things in check, because I think a lot of things that went wrong with you know, the antidepressants and such, is that it became so much of a money driven thing versus an intention thing, I guess. So
yeah. No, that's an important systemic question that I think we need to acknowledge, and in a lot of ways is a great container to end with. This is not going to be an all-encompassing answer, but it's a place for us to start. And I think the place for us to start is an awareness that psychedelics have been inherently politicized by the US by its inclusion on the war on drugs. And what we also need to acknowledge and honor is there's researchers that were behind the scenes that kept this work going, even through the 60s and 70s and 80s and to present day. And so what I can tell you is, being someone on the entrepreneurial side who's getting to be in the rooms with the founder of MAPS, I got to hear a lecture 2 weeks ago from Michael Pollan. He's the most internationally well-known writer on psychedelics since he wrote his book on how to change your mind. And what I am encouraged by is the ethics of those people. So for example, Rick Dovlin, the founder of MAPS, tried to work on an anti-patent company like in the 90s, anticipating that there was going to be this huge flood of people trying to patent like even the color of therapy walls in psychedelic space, and just like how ridiculous it would be. And what's happened is we see people are rushing for patents, but there's some checks and balances that are happening in good ways. I think that there needs to be a healthy and candid acknowledgement that psychiatry is looking for a magic pill, like I referenced, and bioscience and insurance are jumping all over this industry, which is influencing how quickly it's moving in legislative bodies as well. That being said, there's a lot of checkpoints happening with similar legislative movements around protecting wild peyote, around clarifying how we can honor ceremony, differentiate therapy, and also increase access. The reason Oregon went non-medical is to be able to help people access medicines outside of pharmaceuticals and outside of insurance. And so I think to your point, different states are going to become more medicalized, more capitalistic than others. Different countries are going to handle it in different ways. Right now, New Zealand is doing this huge movement in the cannabis space around Indigenous people in New Zealand being the leaders of the medical cannabis industry. In fact, one of my investors is investing in a company they're doing that. So remember, psychedelics is international. They're leading voices that I'm really encouraged by ethically, to your question, and there are definite focuses on profit by groups of people. But then companies like Quantum Mental Health are coming along to change the game on the front end, which is a big distinction. I'm going to close with this to cannabis, because cannabis, by and large, this is going to be my opinion, but I think it's important to acknowledge, cannabis really did not honor voices outside of privileged investors, primarily from Wall Street and Silicon Valley, and acknowledging that many people of color are behind bars for cannabis charges, and most of the legal industry is white-led and white-profited. And so there is now movements 15 years into cannabis of the Minority Cannabis Association and other lobbying groups to redistribute that. But what I will say I am encouraged by on the psychedelic side is there's more of a front-end push that founders, investors have more diversity of representation, which I think will impact, no, I don't just think, I know will impact the ethics. For example, Quantum is non-binary founded, but exclusively led by marginalized identities. And so we're not the only ones, thankfully, but that is an important acknowledgement.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Heather Lundy, for your time this evening, for sharing your wisdom and knowledge, and for enlightening this group. Thank you, everyone, for coming and participating. We hope to see you back at future AZ events.
Thank you all.